Let's talk about self-awareness. What does it mean to be self-aware? Ideally, self-awareness would mean having a clear and unfiltered perception of oneself, to be able to see oneself in such a way that we recognize our own vices, our shortcomings, our limitations, our mistakes, how our behavior affects those around us, and so on. And at the same time, to also recognize our strengths, our abilities, our virtues, and all that sort of thing. And to recognize all of this without judgment, without being hard on ourselves, to be sort of dispassionate about it. And most of us don't see ourselves in this way. Either we have some idealized perception of ourselves, some sort of exaggerated sense of self in which we imagine ourselves as being flawless, perhaps, or we have a diminished self-image, seeing ourselves as less than, as not enough, being inadequate and unworthy. To put it another way, we may be highly conscious of our flaws and shortcomings, but blinded to our virtues and talents and so on, thereby judging ourselves as a failure or incompetent or what have you. Or we may be conscious of our gifts and talents, but blinded to our flaws, thereby deluding ourselves into believing that we have none, that everything we do is good and right and just and perfect, and that we're always right, that we can do no wrong, and if anything ever does go wrong, it's always someone else's fault. And these are really two ends of a spectrum. On one end you have self-deprecation, and on the other end you have conceit or arrogance or what have you. And ideally where we want to be is somewhere in the middle, what we might call humility. Because humility is really the middle ground between these two extremes. Humility is the ability to recognize, to acknowledge our capabilities, our skills, our talents, our virtues, our strengths, our accomplishments, while also acknowledging all the areas still in need of improvement, acknowledging our vices, our mistakes, our limitations, our own ignorance, and so on. To be able to have a balanced view of oneself, to understand that no one is perfect, nor is anyone intrinsically bad. We're all human, and we all have our strengths as well as our weaknesses. But coming back to self-awareness, what this also means is the ability to reflect upon oneself at any given moment, to notice when we're experiencing any sort of emotional disturbance, and to be willing to take responsibility for it, to own it and address it. To be self-aware also means to notice how we're engaging with others and how our words and behaviors affect others, being conscientious of others, noticing when our behavior is unkind or inconsiderate, and then seeking to correct it. How often do you reflect upon yourself, upon your behavior, your attitudes, the way you engage with others? How often do you step back and observe yourself in the way you might observe another person? We're always observing others, always noticing how others behave, perhaps analyzing other people's behavior, and sometimes judging and criticizing. We can often be very well aware of how others behave, and even why they behave the way they do, or what they might do to improve their behavior. And sometimes we're even aware of what others may be thinking and feeling, even when they aren't expressing it. We can be quite skilled at analyzing others to see what's behind their behavior, trying to figure them out, see how they tick. But how much attention do we give to ourselves in this way? How often do we examine our own behaviors and attitudes in order to see what's behind it, or with the intention of improving? How often do we catch ourselves engaging with someone in a way that is inconsiderate or unkind, or perhaps engaging in a way that diminishes them in order to puff up our own ego? Or maybe just noticing how we react emotionally to others when we feel insecure or threatened, when we feel offended or defensive, when we feel the need to be right even when we're wrong. To notice all of this and to observe ourselves in this way, that's what I mean by self-awareness. In fact, it's in relating to others, engaging with others, that we have so much opportunity to develop greater self-awareness. The way we speak to others, our words, our tone of voice, our body language, how we listen, how we respond, our actions, the things we do and don't do, all of this reveals so much if we just pay a little attention to it, examining our own motives, our own emotions, and so on. Relationships are a great place to work on becoming more self-aware, on becoming more understanding and compassionate, more empathetic, not merely being absorbed in our own thoughts and feelings, or seeking our own self-satisfaction, but also taking into consideration the thoughts and feelings of those around you. Sometimes we can behave as if we are the center of the universe, as if our own feelings, our own comfort, our own pleasure is more important than that of others. And we can be so self-absorbed that we don't even take into consideration that other people suffer, that other people get frustrated or overwhelmed, tired or irritated, anxious, afraid, lonely, and so on. Or we just dismiss all of that because it's not our own suffering. But we may also fail to acknowledge how we sometimes contribute to the suffering of others. How some of that suffering is in response to how we engage with others. Now, we could say that everyone's suffering is ultimately their own responsibility. We can even say that everyone creates their own suffering. And so if someone is upset, for example, that's their own emotional response and therefore their own responsibility. We might understand that no one can make you happy or unhappy. No one can make you angry or upset. That is to say that our emotions arise from within us as a response to external stimuli, situations, events, and circumstances. So we can also say that when someone is upset, that's their reaction, that's their responsibility. You can't make someone upset. And that may well be true. But more often than not, we just use this reasoning as an excuse to go on behaving in ways that are unkind and inconsiderate. We use it to excuse our own selfishness. We use it to excuse our own lack of empathy. What I'm suggesting is that we take these situations as opportunities to reflect more deeply in order to understand why we behave this way, because most of the time when we're behaving selfishly and unkindly, it's because of our own internal suffering. And perhaps you don't care very much about other people's suffering. But if you care about your own suffering, maybe you'd like to find a way to resolve it so that you don't suffer so much. And this is also why self-awareness is so important, because we can come to see the mechanisms behind our own suffering in whatever form it happens to take. And the more that we understand our suffering, how it arises, where it arises from, what is at the root of it, the more we have the opportunity to resolve it, to be free of it. And wouldn't that be wonderful, to be free of suffering, or at least to decrease the amount of suffering we experience in life? Once again, to be more self-aware requires self-reflection. For example, if you're engaging with someone and you start to feel uneasy, you might reflect upon that feeling and seek to understand what might be beneath it. Or perhaps you notice that the other person seems to be feeling uneasy around you. You might then reflect upon your own words and behavior to see if their feeling is in response to something that you said or did. And if so, you might examine that more closely to see if you're behaving in a way that is inconsiderate or unkind, and to see if perhaps there's a better way to engage. Self-awareness also requires a certain degree of honesty, humility, self-acceptance, and loving-kindness. rather than self-judgment. But even to be more aware of our own self-judgment and all the ways in which it affects us, how it affects our attitude, our behavior, our beliefs. Because our own self-judgment can also be the very thing preventing us from being more self-aware. It may come with all sorts of uncomfortable and unsettling emotions, and in order to avoid all of that, our tendency is to look away, to look for some distraction. Rather than looking more deeply within, we turn our attention outward. So just notice this when there is shame or self-judgment, and to be willing to look at it, to understand where it's arising from, and to see if you can replace it with self-acceptance, with loving kindness. The more we come to accept ourselves, the easier it is to be self-aware, because there isn't so much judgment standing in the way. So if we feel insecure, for example, rather than judging it, we can examine it without judgment and see why it's there. What's it all about? Why do we feel insecure? And what can we do about it? Or maybe it's just enough to acknowledge it and to accept it as it is. As we become more self-aware, there are many things we'll begin to notice. On the one hand, our relationships will naturally improve. We'll relate better with others, and others will relate better with us in turn. But we'll also notice that our growth has increased, that it's much easier to transform and transcend those thoughts, beliefs, and emotions which generate so much suffering in us. We'll be more able to acknowledge our own weaknesses, limitations, and misconceptions so that we can resolve them or improve upon them, while at the same time discovering our strengths, our virtues, our skills and talents, and developing those as well. So there are many benefits to this in regard to healing our emotional wounds, overcoming difficulties and challenges, overcoming unhealthy habits and behavior patterns, becoming less reactive and more at peace, more content, more confident, happier and healthier, improving the overall quality of life.